Theme 15, Framing the Constitution, the beginning of a new era. The Indian Constitution, which came into effect on 26 January 1950, has the dubious distinction of being the longest in the world, but its length and complexity are perhaps understandable when one considers the country's size and diversity. At independence, India was not merely large and diverse, but also deeply divided. A constitution designated to keep a constitution designed to keep the country together and to take it forward had necessarily to be a to be an elaborate, carefully worked out, and painstakingly drafted document. For one thing, it sought to heal wounds of the past and the present, to make Indians of different classes, caste, communities come together in a shared political experiment. For another, it sought to nurture democratic institutions in what had long been a culture of hierarchy and deference. The Constitution of India was framed between December 1940 and December 1949. During this time, its drafts were discussed clause by clause in the Constituent Assembly of India. In all, the Assembly held 11 sessions, with sittings spread over 165 days. In between the sessions, the work of revising and refining the drafts were carried out by the various committees and subcommittees. From your political science textbook, you know what the Constitution of India is. ठीक है, ठीक है. So the image in the first way showing the Constitution was signed in December 1945 after 3 years of debate. Constitution was signed in December 1949 after 3 years of debate. So the first point, a tumultuous time. The years immediately preceding the making of the Constitution had been exceptionally tumultuous, a time of great hope but also an abject disappointment. On 15 August 1939, India had been made free, but it had also been divided. Fresh in popular memory was the Quit India struggle of 1942, perhaps the most widespread popular movement against the British Raj, as well as the bid by the Subhash Chandra Bose to win freedom through armed struggle with foreign aid. And even more recent upsurge had also evoked much popular sympathy. This was the rising of the ratings of the Royal Indian Navy in Bombay and other cities in the spring of 1946. Through the late 1940s, there were periodic, if scattered, mass protests of workers and peasants in different parts of the country. One striking feature of these popular uprisings was the degree of Hindu Muslim unity they manifested. In contrast, the two leading Indian political parties, the Congress and the Muslim League, had repeatedly failed to arrive at a settlement that would bring about religious reconciliation and social harmony. The Great Calcutta killings of August 1946 began a year of almost continuous rioting across northern and eastern India. The violence culminated in the massacres that accompanied the transfer of the populations when the partition of India was announced. On Independence Day, 15 August 1947, there was an outburst of joy and hope unforgettable for those who lived through that time. But innumerable Muslims in India and Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan were now faced with a cruel choice: the threat of sudden death or sequence, or the threat of sudden death or sequencing of the opportunities on the one side, and a forcible tearing away from their age-old roots on the other. Millions of refugees were on the move. In the image, Jawaharlal Nehru speaking in the Constituent Assembly at midnight of 14 August 1947. It was on this day that Nehru gave his famous speech that began with the following lines: Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. Main text. Another and scarcely less serious problem faced by the new nation was that of the princely states. During the period of the Raj, approximately one third of the areas of the subcontinent was under the control of the Nawabs and Maharajas who owed allegiance to the British crown, but were otherwise left mostly free to rule or misrule their territory as they wished. When the British left India, the constitutional status of these princes remained ambiguous. As one contemporary observer remarked, some Maharajas now began to luxuriate in wild dreams of independent power in an India of many partitions. This was the background in which the Constituent Assembly met. How could the debates within the Assembly remain insulated from what was happening outside? 1.1. The making of the Constituent Assembly. The members of the Constituent Assembly were chosen on the basis of the provincial elections of the 1946. Apart from the members sent by the provinces of the British India, the Assembly also had representatives of the princely states, sent, sent as these states joined the Union one by one. The Muslim League chose to boycott the early sittings, that is, those held before 15 August 1947, making it effectively a one party show as 82% of the members of the assembly were members of the Congress party. However, since the Congress was itself a broad front, these members held a wide range of views. Some were atheists and seculars, others, in the words of an Anglo Indian member Frank Anthony, were technically members of the Congress but spiritually members of the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha. Some were socialist in their economic philosophy, other defenders of the rights of the landlords. Aside from the diversity within it, the Congress also nominated independent members of the different castes and religious groups and tried to ensure representation of women. It particularly sought out law experts. The intense debates that took place within the Constituent Assembly reflected the diversity of opinions. The discussions within the Constituent Assembly were also influenced by the opinions expressed by the public. As the deliberations continued, the arguments were reported in newspapers and the proposals were publicly debated. Criticisms and counter-criticisms in the press in turn shaped the nature of the consensus that was ultimately reached on specific issues. In order to create a sense of collective participation, the public was also asked for submissions. There were hundreds of responses, a sampling of which gives a clue to the conflicting interest that lawmakers had to take account of. Thus, the All India Varnashram Swarajya Sangh, based in Kolkata, the All India Varnashram Swarajya Sangh based in Kolkata. Thus, the All India Varnashram Swarajya Sangh based in Kolkata asked that the constitution be based on the principles laid down in the ancient Hindu works. The prohibition of cow slaughter and the closing down of abattoirs. Abattoir. Abattoirs. Abattoir means kasai khana, slaughter houses. So the prohibition of cow slaughter and closing down of abattoirs was particularly recommended. Low caste groups demanded an end of the ill treatment by the upper caste people, and reservation of separate seats on the basis of their population in legislatures, government departments, and local bodies, etc. Linguistic minorities asked for freedom of speech in the mother tongue, and the redistribution of provinces on linguistic basis. Religious minorities asked for special safeguards, and bodies as varied as district teachers, guild of Vizianagaram, and the Central Jewish Board of Bombay requested adequate representation on all public bodies, including legislatures, etc. 1.2 The dominant voices. The Constituent Assembly had 300 members in all. Of these, 6 members played particularly important roles. Three were the representations of the Congress, namely Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and Rajendra Prasad, and the other three were B.R. Ambedkar, K.M. Munshi, and A.K. Iyer. So it was Nehru who moved the crucial objectives resolution as well as the resolution proposing that the national flag of India be a horizontal tricolor of saffron, white, and dark green in equal proportion, with the white wheel with the wheel in navy blue at the center. Patel, on the other hand, worked mostly behind the scenes, playing a key role in the drafting of the several reports and working to reconcile opposing points of views. Rajendra Prasad's role was as a president of the assembly, where he had to steer the discussions along constructive lines while making sure all members had a chance to speak. Besides this Congress trio, a very important member of the assembly was the lawyer and the economist B.R. Ambedkar. During the period of the British rule, Ambedkar had been a political opponent of the Congress, but on the advice of the Mahatma Gandhi, he was asked as independence to join the Union cabinet as law minister. In this capacity, he served as chairman of the drafting committee of the constitution. Serving with him were the two lawyers, K.M. Munshi from the Gujarat and Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer from Madras, both of whom gave crucial inputs in the drafting of the constitution. These six members were given vital assistance by two civil servants. One was B.N. Rao, the constitutional advisor to the government of India, who prepared a series of background papers based on a close study of the political systems obtaining in other countries. The other was the chief draughtsman. Draughtsman, a person whose job is to do technical drawings. The other was the chief draughtsman S.N. Mukherjee, of whom Ambedkar said that his ability to put the most intricate proposals in the simplest and the clearest legal form can rarely be equaled. Ambedkar himself had the responsibility of guiding the draft constitution through the assembly. This took 3 years in all. with the printed record of the discussions taking up 11 bulky volumes. But while the process was long, it was also extremely interesting. The members of the Constituent Assembly were eloquent in expressing their sometimes very divergent points of view. In their presentations, we can discern many conflicting ideas of India, of what language India should speak, of what political and economic systems the nation should follow, of what moral values its citizens should uphold or disavow. Second point, the vision of the Constitution. On 13 December 1946, 13 December 1946, Jawaharlal Nehru introduced the Objectives Resolution in the Constituent Assembly. It was a momentum resolution that outlined the defining ideals of the Constitution of independent India and provided the framework within which the work of the constitution making was to proceed. It proclaimed India to be an independent sovereign republic, guaranteeing sovereign republic, independent sovereign republic, guaranteed its citizens justice, equality, and freedom, and assured that adequate safeguards shall be provided for minorities, backward and tribal areas, and depressed and OBCs. After outlining these objectives, Nehru placed the Indian experiment in a broad historical perspective. As he spoke, he said his mind went back to the historic efforts in the past to produce such documents of the rights. So, in the box, we are not just going to copy. So, this is what Jawaharlal Nehru said in his famous speech on 13 December 1940. My mind goes back to the various constituent assemblies that have gone before and of what took place at the making of the great American nation when the fathers of that nation met and fashioned out a constitution which has stood the test of the so many years, more than a century and a half, and of the great nation which has been built upon the basis of that constitution. My mind goes back to that mighty revolution which took place also over 150 years ago, and to that constituent assembly that met in that gracious and lovely city of Paris, which had fought so many battles of freedom to the difficulties that constituent assembly had, and to how the king and the other authorities came in its way, and still it continued. The House will remember that when these difficulties came and even the room for a meeting was denied to the then Constituent Assembly, they took themselves to an open tennis court and met there and took the oath, which is called the oath of the tennis court, that they continued meeting in spite of the kings, in spite of the others, and did not disperse till they had finished the task they had undertaken. Well, I trust that it is in the solemn spirit that we too are meeting here, and that we too, whether we meet in this chamber or other chambers, or in the fields or in the marketplace, we will go on meeting and continue our work till we have finished it. Then my mind goes back to a more recent revolution which gave rise to a new type of state, the revolution that took place in Russia, and out of which has arisen the Union of the Socialist Republics, another mighty country which is playing a tremendous part in the world, not only a mighty country but for us in India, a neighboring country. So our mind goes back to these great examples as we seek to learn from their success and to avoid their failures. Perhaps we may not be able to avoid failures because some measures of is inherent in human effort. Nevertheless, we shall advance, I am certain, in spite of obstructions and difficulties, and achieve and realize the dream that we have dreamt so long. We say that it is our firm and solemn resolve to have an independent sovereign republic. India is bound to be sovereign, it is bound to be independent, and it is bound to be republic. Now, some friends have raised the question, why have you not put the word democratic here? Well, I told them that it is conceivable, of course, that a republic may not be democratic, but the whole of our past is witness to this fact that we stand for the democratic institutions. Obviously, we are aiming at democracy and nothing less than a democracy. What form of democracy, what shape it might take is another matter. The democracies of the present day, many of them in Europe or elsewhere, have played a great part in the world's progress. Yet it may be doubtful if those democracies may not have to change their shape somewhat before long if they have to remain completely democratic. We are not going just to copy, I hope, a certain democratic procedure or an institution of a so called democratic country. We may improve upon it. In any event, whatever system or government we may establish here must fit in within the temper of our people and be acceptable to them. We stand for democracy. It will be for this House to determine what shape to give to that democracy, the fullest democracy, I hope. The House will notice that in this resolution, although we have not used the word democratic because we thought it is obvious that the word republic contains the word, and we did not want to use unnecessary words and redundant words. But we have done something much more than using the word. We have given the content of democracy in this resolution, and not only the content of democracy, but the content, if I may say so, of economic democracy in this resolution. Others might take objection to this revolution on the ground that we have not said we have not said that it should be a socialist state. Well, I stand for socialism, and I hope India will stand for socialism, and that India will go towards the construction of a socialist state. And I do believe that the whole world will have to go that way. This is from the Constituent Assembly Debate, Volume 1. 42nd Constitutional Amendment 1976 added socialist, secular, and integrity in the preamble. Three words: socialist, secular, and integrity in the preamble. Now, the main text. Now, this Nehru speech. Nehru speech merits careful scrutiny. What exactly was being stated here? What did Nehru's seemingly nostalgic return to the past reflect? What was he saying about the origin of the ideas embodied in the vision of the Constitution? In returning to the past and referring to the American and the French revolutions, Nehru was locating the history of the Constitution making in India within a longer history of struggle for liberty and freedom. The momentous nature of Indian project was emphasized by linking it to revolutionary movements in the past. But Nehru was not suggesting that those events were to provide any blueprint for the present, or that the ideas of those revolutions could be mechanically borrowed and applied in India. He did not define the specific form of democracy and suggest that this had to be decided through deliberations, and he stressed that the ideals and provisions of the constitution introduced in India could not be just derived from elsewhere. We are not going just to copy, he said. The system of the government established in India, he declared, had to fit in with the temper of our people and be acceptable to them. It was necessary to learn from the people of the West, from their achievements and failures, but the Western nations too had to learn from experiments elsewhere. They too had to change their own notions of democracy. The objective of the Indian constitution would be to fuse the liberal ideas of democracy with the socialist idea of economic justice and readapt and rework all these ideas within the Indian context. Nehru's plea was for creative thinking about what was appropriate for India. 2.1 The Will of the People. A communist member, Somnath Lahiri. So Somnath Lahiri जो था वो communist member था. A communist member, Somnath Lahiri, saw the dark hand of British imperialism hanging over the deliberations of the Constituent Assembly. Somnath Lahiri thus argued the members and the Indians in general to fully free themselves from the influences of the imperial rule. In the winter of 1946-47, as the assembly deliberated, the British were still in India. An interim administration headed by the Jawaharlal Nehru was in place, but it could only operate under the directions of the Viceroy and the British government in London. Lahiri exhorted his colleagues to realize that the Constituent Assembly was British made and was working the British plans as the British should like it to be worked out. Nehru admitted that most nationalist leaders had wanted a different kind of constituent assembly. It was also true, in a sense, that the British government had a hand in its birth, and it had attained and it had attached certain conditions within which the assembly had to function. But emphasized Nehru, you must not ignore the source from which the assembly derives its strength. Nehru added, governments do not come into being by state papers. Governments are in fact the expression of the will of the people. We have met here today because of the strength of the people behind us, and we shall go as far as the people, not of any party or group, but the people as a whole, shall wish us to go. We should therefore always keep in mind the passions that lie in the hearts of the masses of the Indian people and try to fulfill them. The Constituent Assembly was expected to express the aspirations of those who had participated in the movement of the independence. Democracy, equality, and justice were ideals that had become intimately associated with the social struggle in India since the 19th century. When the social reformers in the 19th century opposed child marriage and demanded that widows be allowed to remarry, they were pleading for social justice. When Swami Vivekananda campaigned for a reform of Hinduism, he wanted religions to become more just. When Jyotiba Phule in Maharashtra pointed to the suffering of the depressed classes or communists and socialist organized workers and peasants, they were demanding economic and social justice. The national movement against a government that was seen as oppressive and illegitimate, was inevitably a struggle for democracy and justice, for citizens' right and equality. So the figure showing Edwin Montagu left was the author of the Montagu Cell. Edwin Montagu was the author of the Montagu Chelmsford that or Montfort reforms of 1919, which allowed some form of representation in provincial legislative assembly, some form of representation in the provincial legislative assembly, according to the Montfort reforms. So in the main text, in fact, as the demand for representation grew, the British had been forced to introduce a series of constitutional reforms. A number of acts were passed in 1919, gradually enlarging the space of the Indian participation in provincial governments. The executive was made partly responsible to the provincial legislature in 1919 and almost entirely so under the government of India at 1935. When elections were held in 1970s, under the 1970 Act, the Congress came into power in 8 out of the 11 provinces. Yet we shall 8 out of 11 provinces. पिछले चैप्टर में बोलो 7 out of 11 provinces. Yet we should not see an unbroken continuity between the earlier constitutional developments and what happened in the 3 years from 1940. While the earlier constitutional experiments were in response to the growing demand of the representative government, the acts 1935 were not directly debated and formulated by Indians. They were enacted by colonial government. The electorate that elected the provincial bodies had expanded over the years, but even in 1935 it remained limited to more than 10 to 15% of the adult population. There was no universal adult franchise. The legislatures elected under the 1935 Act operated within the framework of the colonial rule and were responsible to the governor appointed by the British. The vision that the Nehru was trying to outline on 13 December 1940 was of the constitution of an independent sovereign republic of India.